Seattle Pacific University. Thank you all for coming. I'm Dr. Reed Davis. I'm chairman of the Department of Political Science and Geography here at SPU, and I'm delighted that you are not only here, but we have, I think, a very distinguished and an outstanding panel for you this evening. Changing what we tax, prospects for a free enterprise solution to energy security and climate change. I have the distinction of introducing you to the panel, and let me begin first with Dr. Yoram Bauman, our moderator. Dr. Bauman is a math guy from Reed College, PhD in economics from the University of Washington. He is one of the country's few stand-up economists. He has shared a stage with the screamingly funny Robin Williams and the even funnier Paul Krugman. So we are pleased to have Dr. Bauman here. I am delighted to see my friend Todd Myers. Mr. Myers has been a fixture in Washington state campaigns and politics for many years. He is now the director of the Center for the Environment at the Washington Policy Center. He has been active in public relations and marketing, has represented the Seattle Mariners, as well as working as clients with the Seattle Supersonics, which is a team most of you undergraduates have probably never heard of. We also have, I am pleased to say, Representative Bob Inglis with us as well, who represented South Carolina's 4th District as a Republican. He served from 93 to 99, and then again from 2005 to 2011. When he was in Congress, he was the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Energy and the Environment, and served on the Committee on Foreign Affairs as well. Earlier this year, Representative Inglis used his expertise to launch the Energy and Enterprise Initiative, which is dedicated to using free enterprise to deliver the fuels and the energy of the future. I am also most pleased to introduce you to Professor Mike Wallace from the University of Washington. You need know only 2 things about Professor Wallace. First, he is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Second, he has a building named after him over at the University of Washington. So we are thrilled to have Professor Wallace with us this evening. He is a professor of climate science at the UW. So if you would welcome all of our panelists with a round of applause.
Super. Thank you so much, Reed, and thank you to all of you for coming to join us tonight. We're going to start with some opening remarks, and I think we'll just go this way. So starting with Mike Wallace, and then Bob Inglis, and closing with Todd Myers. And then I may ask a couple of questions, and then we want to have a lot of time for conversations and questions and comments from the audience. We definitely have to wrap up by 8:45. And so I will, in my efforts as moderator, I will make use of the time that I've been emceeing stand-up comedy shows, and will give people the red light as necessary, and otherwise try to keep things moving. So we're going to start with Professor Mike Wallace.
Great. Well, thank you, Yoram. Well, I'm here mainly as a resource person for just dealing with questions about the science.
Hang on 1 second. Can everybody hear okay? Maybe speak a little bit more into the mic. Does the mic work?
Is it? Yeah. So
hold it a little closer.
Okay. Good. So I'm very pleased to be here and to participate. I usually teach science courses, but it's really interesting, and look forward to being a part of the discussion on policy. So I'm going to, in my brief remarks at the beginning, I'm going to try to make 3 points. First, that human-induced global warming is real, and it's very likely to become a major problem by the end of this century. Second, that over the contiguous United States, at least, the amount of warming thus far isn't large enough to have major impacts all by itself. Severe weather events have caused unprecedented damage in recent years, but that's mainly because environmental degradation of a variety of forms is rendering our society and our economy more vulnerable to environmental disruptions. And thirdly, I'll argue that because of this interconnectedness of environmental issues, that it doesn't make sense to talk about climate policy in isolation, though I should qualify that by saying I think a meeting like this is fine, but in the long term, I think we have to deal with things in a broader context. So in my first point, just to point out a few things you're already aware of, that carbon dioxide concentrations are rising at about 0.6% per year. They're already halfway to a doubling compared to what they were at the time of the Industrial Revolution. And if we continue with business as usual, they will double well before the end of this century, and they could well triple or even possibly quadruple in the next century. CO2 levels haven't been as high as they are today since back before the current series of ice ages that began 1 or 2 million years ago. Geochemist Wally Broker has referred to our modification of the composition of the atmosphere as a gigantic and dangerous experiment and a form of Russian roulette. Even global warming skeptics, my friend Dick Lindzen from MIT, would readily agree that the Earth is going to get warmer as a result of the buildup of carbon dioxide and other man-made greenhouse gases. It's just a question of how much and how fast. The latest we have from the IPCC, their 2007 report, predicted a warming of about 3 degrees Celsius by the end of this century relative to pre-industrial concentrations. If you argue that this estimate is too high, I won't disagree with you, but I'll challenge you to convince me that it might not be too low. Uncertainty cuts both ways. The Earth has, in fact, been warming, and there are good reasons to believe that much of the warming that we've experienced in the last century is human-induced. The warming shows up clearly in the historical temperature records, which I've worked with myself. And it's also evident in the retreat of glaciers and quite dramatically now with the thinning and the melting of sea ice in the Arctic, and of course blooming dates of plants, migration dates of birds, ranges of species, and many other kinds of data. But just because human-induced global warming is a serious long-term issue doesn't mean that it should be the focus of our discourse on environmental policy. And that brings me to my second point, that the most direct impacts of human-induced climate change are far off in the future, and over most of the Earth, with the exception of places like the Arctic, the present impacts are still fairly subtle. It's the vulnerability to extreme events. That's the thing that's increasing rapidly. Just to cite an example of that, the global warming that we've experienced thus far is only about 1 degree Fahrenheit. That's about 7/10 of a degree Celsius. And to put that into perspective, this summer there were places in the Great Plains that were recording record high temperatures of 115 degrees. In the absence of global warming, that would have only been 114 degrees. That's not a big difference. And in fact, many of the all-time high temperature records in those areas were set during the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s, and they're still standing even after 80 years of global warming. What's new is that a drought in the Great Plains can have such a big impact on world food prices. And I don't think that's just due to globalization. And I'd like to spend the remainder of my remarks here trying to defend that statement. Several different kinds of human-induced environmental changes are putting pressure on global food production. Food production in the world's two most heavily populated countries, India and China, has become increasingly dependent on fossil groundwater. The development of cheap technology for tube wells that was developed back in the 1990s has made this deep groundwater much more accessible. And the farmers there are using it big time. For a while, the Indian government was even subsidizing drilling them. When that water runs out, and water tables are already dropping, plummeting in some areas, food production in those countries is going to become much more susceptible to drought. Now you can irrigate during those times, but if that water isn't there, then droughts, even like we've had during the last few summers, are going to cause a lot of loss of food. Ironically, much of the fresh water that's being used for irrigation today is being squandered, and to the extent of being poured out over land in quantities that have the effect of increasing the salinity. And as a result of that, there's substantial amounts of farmland in India, in parts of China, in parts of the former Soviet Union around the Aral Sea, and even a few areas in the United States where that used to be arable that are going out of production as the land becomes too saline to support food production. And this is largely because of overwatering. On top of that, each year, the world is losing about 1% of its remaining topsoil, mostly due to wasteful land management practices. U.S. farmers are compensating for the deteriorating soil quality by using more fertilizers, but that's not an option for the farmers in the world's poorest countries. And on top of all of those, climate change is yet another source of increased vulnerability. Field experiments conducted by agronomists indicate that grain production declines by about 10% for each 1 degree Celsius rise in temperature. So that amounts to a loss of 7 or 8 tenths of a percent. I should say 7 or 8% so far, but it could easily grow to tens of percent in the next few decades if the IPCC projections are right. So after major gains following the Green Revolution, world food production is leveling off, and there's concern that it could actually begin to decrease as the limitations of the availability of arable land and fresh water, the fertility of the soil, the optimality of the climate all come into play, all pushing in the same direction. Food commodities prices have risen substantially over the past decade, and world grain reserves have been declining as well. Meanwhile, world population is expected to continue to increase for at least a few more decades, and there will be increasing demand for grain to feed livestock in developing countries like China, whose citizens hunger for more meat in their diets like those rich Americans. One could argue that food security shouldn't be a problem in this country. Most U.S. farmers don't rely heavily on fossil groundwater, and Americans grow more food than they consume. But in our global economy, the problems of the developing world, and especially China, are our problems as well. If the country that's financing a large fraction of our national debt comes to us in a drought year and asks to buy most of our grain, just saying no might not be an option. The U.S. military has been doing contingency planning for food security crises, and we're beginning to see some discussion of these issues in the business community. A notable example is Jeremy Grantham, the founder of GMO, a highly successful company that advises investors. Grantham's quarterly newsletters are readily available on the web. I'd be glad to direct anybody who's interested to them. So in conclusion, quibbling about whether global warming is real or how big it's going to be or whether it's responsible for the latest hurricane or snowstorm or flood or drought I don't think that would be a productive use of our time. I hope that there will be a time when we can have some real serious discussion of what we can do both here in the U.S. and around the world to bring our environmental management practices, not only our carbon emissions, but also our water management, our agricultural practices, fisheries, and our use of non-renewable resources into balance with the inherent limitations of our planet's support system. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Wallace. Next, we'll turn to Representative Bob Inglis.
So let me start with some audience participation here. Fellow conservatives here, raise your hand if you consider yourself a conservative. Know a conservative? Raise your hand. Seen one in a zoo? Anybody? Oh, you're here maybe to see one. That may be what's happening. So yes, anytime that a Republican is around talking about action on energy and climate, you got to assume that he must not be a conservative, right? Must be some kind of mushy moderate. So let me just give you some numbers to make sure we set that record straight. I have a 93 American Conservative Union rating, 100% Christian Coalition, 100% National Right to Life, A with the NRA, 0 with the ADA, Americans for Democratic Action, and a 23 by some mistake with the AFL-CIO. I really wanted a 0, and I demand a recount. Sore subject because Boeing has just got that new facility in Charleston, South Carolina. So you're looking at a conservative from South Carolina, right? But you also heard that I was in Congress 6 years, out 6 years, came back for another 6. I thought that I was going to be there a lot longer. But I got specifically uninvited to this tea party they were having, and I thought I was a affable enough fella, maybe be invited to the party, but I was uninvited to the party and was tossed out of Congress in a Republican primary in June of 2010. Very polite to not mention that in the introduction. It just sort of, he left Congress after 6 years. No, he was tossed out of Congress after 6 more years. Now what I'm doing is, I committed various heresies. I was for sort of comprehensive immigration reform. That's a heresy. I voted against the troop surge, had conservative concerns about that. Thought it was nation building. But my most enduring heresy was just saying climate change is real and let's do something about it. I voted against cap and trade because I think it's a hopelessly complicated solution that is embarrassing for its free allocations, decimates American manufacturing, and is basically a substantial growth of government scheme. So I voted against it for all those reasons. But I proposed an alternative, which is something that Yoram can speak to better than I could, which is a revenue-neutral tax swap. Now, most economists call that a revenue-neutral carbon tax. But if you say carbon, conservatives break out in hives. And if you say tax, they go into anaphylactic shock. And so what you need to do is call it something different. So we call it a revenue-neutral tax swap. If you can say swap fast enough after the word tax, you avoid the anaphylactic reaction. And so it is a tax swap. And so what I'm here, which you've just heard from a very notable scientist, and I was, as you heard earlier, on the science committee, but I'm not a scientist. I just played one when the lights came on at the committee. And so, but I'm a commercial real estate lawyer, right? So I've got a deal for you to present to you here that really could probably fit on a cocktail napkin, because the way you judge a commercial real estate deal is if it can fit on a cocktail napkin, it's worth doing. If it can't fit on a cocktail napkin, you don't do the deal. That's sort of a rule about commercial real estate and corporate finance generally. And so what I'm about to describe, I think, will fit on a cocktail napkin. And I think that if you're one of those few conservatives, raise your hand with me, you'll see why it makes sense from a conservative perspective. But if you're a progressive here, you might also see that it makes sense from your perspective as well. So it's basically this. Let's change what we tax. We currently tax income, but we don't tax emissions. So why would we not want to reduce taxes on something we want more of, which is income, and subjective taxation, something we want less of, which is emissions, which the economists will tell you here that's a Pigovian tax scheme. Basically, the idea is to tax things you want less of or that you find undesirable. That logic has attracted even people like Art Laffer, Ronald Reagan's economics advisor. While I was hunted and bagged as a rhino, Republican in name only, I don't think that anybody can claim that Art Laffer is a rhino. He is the original Ronald Reagan guy. And Art Laffer says he's agnostic as to climate change. He could benefit from spending some time with Dr. Wallace. But he says he's agnostic as to climate change. He says he doesn't need to know whether it's real or not. He says, all I need to know is you're taxing something you want more of. And you're not taxing something you maybe want less of. He said, change what you tax. It's a no-brainer. So that's where we start with the cocktail napkin is point number one. Let's just change what we tax. Point number two is why are we distorting the marketplace by these subsidies for various fuel sources? What if we eliminated all the subsidies for all the fuels? No more cylinders, but also no more accelerated depreciation for oil and gas, leasing rigs and those sorts of things. We just say no more subsidies for any fuels. And then the third point on the napkin, and really this is the end of the deal, is then let's attach all cost to all fuels. Let's make it so all the fuels are fully accountable for all of their cost. And that means attaching, it sounds like I'm playing not just a scientist but an economist here. It means internalizing the negative externalities, right? The hidden costs associated with fuels. Let's just attach them. Let's make it so the market can judge the product. And so what I'd say to you is even if you're here as a climate skeptic and need to spend some more time with Professor Wallace, even if you think it's hooey, the health effects of, for example, coal-fired electricity and we're not talking climate change there, we're just talking health effects. The soot from coal-fired electrical plants in the United States causes 23,600 premature deaths each year and over 3 million lost work days. Those are real and quantifiable costs. Again, whether you assume that climate change has a zero cost, the health effects of just the soot from coal-fired electrical plants is substantial. Now, some would dispute that's an ABT study in 2004 that says 23,600 people die prematurely each year in the United States and 3 million lost workdays. But if you dispute those numbers and think, no, it's not that much, well, it's somewhere north of zero. And all you got to do is go ask your local pulmonologist about that. Actually, maybe not here. In South Carolina, you would, because the ocean brings nice air to you, and you don't have many coal-fired plants west of you here. Well, you got some big ones way across the pond, but so you're doing all right maybe here on the pulmonology thing. But if you're in South Carolina, you know that you're seeing patients who are dealing with the soot that's coming into their lungs, and those people are dying prematurely. And so what we're saying at the Energy Enterprise Initiative is, in addition to that tax swap that we talked about, in addition to eliminating all the subsidies, in addition to attaching all cost, what we're really talking about is another kind of, a fourth and last point would be eliminating a health tax that's currently in place. We're not paying at the meter for that coal-fired electricity. We're not paying the accurate price of it. We're paying elsewhere. So if you're insured by the people who go to those pulmonologists who get treated for the lung disease, that affects your premiums. If you're just an American taxpayer, you're paying for some of them that are covered by Medicare, others that are covered by Medicaid, and your costs are higher there than they would be. Or you're paying through various means of cost shift at your local hospital. The result of all of which is that you're paying all right, unless, if you'll pardon me if you're progressive, unless you're some hopeless liberal or some wild-eyed liberal who just cannot see reality. You gotta believe with me as a conservative, there is no such thing as a free lunch. the title of Milton Friedman's book in 1975. No such thing as a free lunch. We're paying all the costs of coal-fired electricity. So one of the worst arguments, I would say, and I close with this, against what we're saying is one that's often heard on the radio. It's a dominant tune on the radio. Is the worst thing you could do is cause energy prices to go up. Well, these folks must believe in the tooth fairy, perhaps Santa Claus, because they must think that somehow we're not paying the full cost of that electricity. No, we're paying all right. It's just you're paying in hidden ways on the health insurance. Why not put it on the meter? If you put it on the meter, then all kinds of innovation becomes possible. You here in the capital of innovation know all about that. I mean, if you have people out to make a buck, serving consumers who have a felt need, innovation can happen very rapidly. Much more rapidly, we would contend, by that price signal, by an accurate and accountable, efficient, transparent marketplace, than by clumsy government mandates with regulators driving around to see how you're doing energy at your house, or by fickle tax incentives that expire, or production tax credits that run out at the end of the year, and you have to go lobby people in Congress to extend them. All those sorts of things are clumsy compared to just an elegant price signal that makes it so that consumers, in enlightened self-interest and liberty, decide how to get there. They'll get there much more rapidly than government could ever get us there. So all those progressives, now raise your hand if you're willing to be a conservative now. It's all right? Give me an amen, and I'll stop preaching about conservatism.
When you were talking about depreciation for oil leases, though, and that really made my heart flutter, and that was terrific. Thank you, Bob. Todd Myers.
So my name is Todd Myers. Some of the things that I did in fact work for the Mariners, whose jerseys are partly green, so that is why I'm interested in environmental policy. The Sonics, of course, were green. But I also did work at the Washington State Department of Natural Resources and was on the executive team there and dealt with forestry policy. And so I've actually been dealing with environmental policy for about a dozen years. But I also got a master's degree from the University of Washington in Russian studies. And so when you were talking about the Aral Sea, I know quite a bit about what the Soviet Union did to the Aral Sea, and there's actually a great story in talking about topsoil. So when perestroika kicked in and Gorbachev started inviting companies from other countries, from Germany and other around the world, to show what capitalism was, to show how the free market worked, to try to reinvigorate the Soviet economy. There was a German company that came and was going to build a factory in the Soviet Union. And one of the first things they did when they built this factory was they scraped off all the topsoil, right? Because they were going to build on top of it. They're going to put concrete and other things like that. And the Soviets had never seen this before. They said, why are you doing this? Why are you scraping off the topsoil? And they said, because we're going to save it, because it's valuable. We can use it. When you put a value on something, when you put a price on something, people figure out a way to preserve it, to make the best use of it. And that is the fundamental idea behind a carbon price. And it is why the free market is so much better at helping the environment bit by bit in small ways than the political solutions that we're currently following. Because fundamentally what the free market is good at doing is doing more with less. And when you deal with resources and environmentalism, that's the heart of environmentalism, a concern about scarce resources, about doing more with less. And why not harness this unbelievable creativity and power that comes from the free market? The very thing that caused that German company to do something very simple, like scrape off that topsoil, because they recognized the value of it. And you see that time and again in the free market. And that's what I want to talk about, is why a carbon tax makes sense as opposed to the alternatives that we have out there and the political approaches that we're currently taking, which I think won't end up helping us actually reduce carbon and help the environment. Ultimately, the choice is, in terms of reducing carbon emissions, is one of technology versus lifestyle. Those are generally the two types of policy approaches that you can take. We hear a lot of things about changing people's lifestyles, right? Getting people on transit, building light rail, changing how we live, the size of our homes, things like that. People tend not to like that, right? They want to live the life that they want to live, and telling people, here's how you're going to live, here's how you're going to travel, all of those sorts of things, it's very difficult to get people to change their lifestyle, to conform to a notion about, okay, here's what we've got to do. The alternative approach, though, is to give them technology and give them options for how to do it. So for instance, if you want to reduce transportation carbon emissions, in Washington State, that's the game, right? We have hydro, we have nuclear, we have wind, we have lots of things. The city of Seattle is essentially carbon neutral for Seattle City Light. So if you're trying to reduce energy consumption as a way to reduce carbon emissions, you're essentially doing nothing. Transportation is really where the game is. So if you say, okay, we're going to build light rail, and that's going to help reduce carbon emissions. The problem is that light rail doesn't go where people want it to go necessarily. Some people will take it. Some people will get off of buses. But there are other alternatives. Some people can buy a hybrid. Some people can drive less. Some people can carpool. Some people can spend one day a week telecommuting. When you give folks all of those options, you do two things. One, you harness their creativity to find out what's the best way to achieve the goal, rather than hoping that a few planners can figure out, here's the way that we can best achieve this. All of us in this room know how we can best reduce the amount of energy that we use. And if we put a price on that energy, we want to reduce that. So why not harness all of that creativity? And second, no two people are the same. Right? A traveling salesman can't stay at home and telecommute. They have to go out. But there are other things that they can do. They can buy a more fuel-efficient vehicle. And so putting a price on it and harnessing that technology is a much more effective way. And when you look at environmental improvement over time, the biggest environmental improvements have come not from lifestyle changes, but from technology. So the question is, how do you create a policy that harnesses that incentive to create new technology and do more with less? So just today, California, which has instituted a cap and trade system, had their first auction, and they haven't released the results of how much it costs. They'll release it, I think, next week, for what each carbon credit costs. So if you want to emit a ton of carbon, you have to buy a carbon credit. But what the reports are is that it's about the same as what carbon futures are going for right now, which is about $12 a ton. And that's a very important metric, because what it says is, if you have $12 in your pocket, you can go down to California and buy a ton of carbon and put it in your pocket. And that's a ton of carbon that cannot be emitted. So that sets a good price point for, are you doing things that are less expensive than that or more expensive? Because if you're doing things that are more expensive than that, you're wasting opportunity. You're spending, right, if you're spending $120 instead of $12, you're getting 1/10 the amount of environmental benefit that you could get simply by buying a carbon credit in California. So it's a good price point to judge the policies that we're looking at, to say, are we spending too much, or is this a good deal? And the fact is that a lot of the political things that we do right now are horribly expensive. So let me just give you 3 examples. So over in Issaquah, near where I live, there is what's called a Z home. And the Z home is a zero emissions home, and they do a variety of different things to make it zero emissions. They have solar panels, they have a geothermal heat pump, which is actually kind of cool technology. They have a whole variety of things that are designed to make it zero emissions. And so I ran the calculations. I compared the size of the house to a townhome that was right next to it that wasn't a Z home, and said, okay, what's the difference for the same square footage? And I estimated how many tons of carbon they were going to reduce over a 40-year lifespan of the building, and it costs about $100 a ton. Okay? So when you compare $100 a ton to $12, you're spending huge amounts of money for very little benefit. The sad thing is that that's actually not even the worst. So if you look at biofuels, right, and I mentioned that transportation is one of the big areas that we need to cut carbon emissions. Biofuels, if you do corn-based ethanol, it costs about $275 per metric ton of CO2. right? So now we're spending more than 20 times what they're spending in California. But that's not even the worst. The worst, I think, is probably solar. Solar is unbelievably inefficient. And in fact, what you find, depending on the type of energy that you're replacing, you see numbers in terms of solar costs from $300 to $600 per ton of CO2. And in Washington State at the Coyote Ridge Reformatory over in eastern Washington, I want to let everybody know that Washington State prides itself on being home to the greenest prison in the country. They actually sent out a press release saying it's the greenest prison in the country. And one of the reasons that they said that was that it has solar panels. And they spent $880,000 on these solar panels. Well, the average lifespan of solar panels is about 20 to 25 years before you have to upgrade them. And in fact, in 20 years, you probably won't want those solar panels because the new solar panels will be much more efficient anyway. You wouldn't want to hang on to them. But let's say it's 20 years, and I calculated the amount of energy savings that you would save over that period of time, and it's about $140,000. But the key is that it's also carbon free. And so if you put a price on carbon, okay, say you save $140,000 that you would have had to spend on electricity, what's the value of the carbon? And so I valued the carbon actually at $20 a ton, because that was what the Kyoto prices in Europe are. So at $20 a ton over 20 years for the Coyote Ridge, it's about $6,700 worth of CO2. And if you calculate out the difference between that $140,000 and $880,000, they're paying $1,000 a ton for every ton of CO2 that's reduced. California is paying $12 a ton. Waste of money is waste of resources. And if you're spending $1,000 a ton and instead of $12, you're harming the environment, because you're taking money that could do good things for the environment and you're spending it on something else. And what we're spending it on is political image. The reason that we like solar panels on CenturyLink Field or on Coyote Ridge or other places is because people can point to them. And if you talk to solar panel installers, they will tell you that they have installed solar panels on the north side of houses where the sun doesn't shine. Why? Because that's where the neighbors are. Okay? That's what we're subsidizing. And the problem is that when we make political decisions, we don't make decisions based on the most bang for the buck. And if we care about the environment, we will do more with less. We will use every dollar. And what the great thing about the carbon tax does is it is technology agnostic. It says, I don't care what you do to reduce your carbon emissions. Whether you don't drive one day a week, whether you buy a hybrid, whether you buy a Leaf, whether you ride the bus, whether you carpool, whatever you do, you will get rewarded for reducing that CO2. That's the way to do it, to move away from a political approach where we pick and choose the technologies primarily because of their image benefit as opposed to their environmental benefit. And a carbon tax does that so much better than cap and trade or subsidizing solar or so many of the other things that we do. And that's why the free market, ultimately, when you look at it, has had such a greater impact on environmental benefit over time than individual regulations. This is not an argument that says we don't need regulations. Absolutely we do, because there are external costs. You cannot allow people to pollute the water or pollute the air and impose the costs on all of us, as you were talking about with coal plants. The question is, how do you deal with those? And if the choice is between improving technology or reforming lifestyle, technology works better every time, and the best way to promote new technologies is the free market. Thanks.
All right, and thank you to all of our panelists. Todd is too modest to mention this, but he's got a book out called Eco Fads, which is available in bookstores everywhere. I've got 3 questions, 1 question for each of the panelists, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A from the audience, I think. And I'm going to start with Professor Wallace, and maybe these are yes-no questions, and one of them might bother you because you said before that we shouldn't get into it too much, but and I know that you were involved with the early IPCC reports, and So the two questions are, question number one is there a connection between climate change and Hurricane Sandy, just because it's been in the news a lot lately? And the second question is, and these are both potentially yes/no questions, how well has the IPCC, has it done pretty well?
The first one with Sandy, I would say a very, very tiny connection with respect to the intensity of the storm, but a more substantial connection with the level to which the sea rose in the storm surge. We're talking about an extra 8 inches there or something like that because of the global warming contribution. So that's the first question.
Has the IPCC done,
and how
done,
is
a, done a good job?
IPCC? I would give them certainly an A- at least. I think they have not exaggerated the science. They've been, if you read the reports over the years, they've been pretty consistent, and I think that at any given time, they've been giving us the best estimate of what's projected.
And if either of you want to chime in, feel free to. Otherwise, my questions for you, Bob Inglis, is there's actually been a lot in the news lately about carbon taxes in the national press. There was back and forth with Grover Norquist from Americans for Tax Reform, who originally said that he thought maybe it wouldn't violate the pledge, and then he said that it would violate the pledge. There was some news with Jeff Flake, who co-sponsored the bill with you, where he was sort of pushed on carbon tax issues, and then you were just at a conference co-sponsored by the American Enterprise Institute, an all-day carbon tax conference that was standing room only in Washington, D.C. So what's your read on all of that those recent developments?
Well, it was very encouraging yesterday in Washington, Washington State, and back to back. And so in Washington, D.C. yesterday, it really was, as Shoreham just said, standing room only. And for a lot of the time that we've been talking about carbon taxes, it's been a rather much smaller discussion, but it was a room full of people. And there seems to be a lot of energy around it in Washington at the moment. The reason for that is we face this fiscal cliff, and there's a need to come up with a way to avert the fiscal cliff. And so some people think that it could happen here pretty soon, that we could have a way to, from a conservative perspective, broaden the base, tax base, bring down the rates by changing what we tax, doing this tax swap that I've been talking about. From the progressive perspective, it's going to be explained, if that happens, as, listen, we protected Medicare and Medicaid by getting additional revenue in the form of a carbon tax. Of course, that'll be the different explanations about the change in policy. So some people think it could happen before the end of the year. I'd be very excited if it happened before the end of the year, because then Alex Bosmosky and I, who's walking around here somewhere, the Energy and Enterprise Initiative would insist on a bonus, and we'd finish up for the year and take the next year off. I don't think that's. I think it's more likely that Congress is going to kick the can down the road and come up with some extension for the next year. And during that year, there'll be further discussions about what to do about the fiscal fix. It'll delay or postpone the coming to the cliff, if you will, by this kicking the can down the road. And I think the most likely scenario is it takes even a little bit longer than that to really debate all of this through. Because this is what I'm proposing here on that cocktail napkin I was talking about is actually a rather major change in policy of the United States. So while it can fit on a cocktail napkin, it is a big switch, and that needs to be fully debated and vetted, and there are a lot of questions about how you implement a functional and efficient tax swap. But I'm hopeful that we may, because of Sandy and other things, be moving some beyond denial and toward debate. That's a very good progression as far as I'm concerned, to get to debating what is the best way to do this, rather than to be just standing in denial of what's becoming patently obvious facts. And so, by the way, if I could chime in on the Sandy thing, this is certainly not a scientific perspective. It's just this sort of commonsensical perspective. Sandy is basically the exclamation point at the end of a run-on sentence that has words like drought and wildfires and Arctic ice melt and record high temperatures. Comes an exclamation point called Sandy, and there will be others yet to come that will add exclamation points. And while we're waiting for the official diagnosis, it's sort of like our health conditions. We generally know something's wrong before we hear it from the doctor, right? If you get halfway up the flight of steps and you're winded, you know what you're going to hear from the doctor. It's probably something about a stent. It may be Lipitor, or it may be open heart surgery, but you really sort of know before you even get to the doctor, right? And so we sort of know there's something happening, and because experience is a very effective but often harsh teacher. And so we're being taught about climate. It's just, if we can move beyond denial and into debate about how to do this and what's the best way, that'd be a very exciting change for me. And that's what I think I was seeing in Washington yesterday, is some of that. But summation there is, hopefully there's some real movement, but it may be just an early spring, and more denial may be coming, but then it'll come back up, I believe, and we will have a full debate about how to accomplish this policy shift.
Super. And my question for you, Todd, is that as a conservative who argues for market-based solutions to climate change and recognizes that climate change is a problem, has the election, so these were all attempts to do questions that were about relatively recent events, has the election made your job easier or more difficult?
I don't think either. I think the fundamental problem with climate policy and politics is that climate policy is used more as a political bludgeon than as a policy discussion. And so what you hear from the left is Republicans are anti-science because they're a bunch of climate-denying Neanderthals. That is not a policy discussion that is likely to engage conservatives. It is a bludgeon to attack your political opponents. Conservatives respond with, climate change is a hoax from a bunch of people who are, this is only the latest thing in order to try to control the economy to achieve a Euro-socialist approach, okay? That is not a discussion that is likely to engage the left. So that's how we discuss climate policy and politics. And it is not an honest discussion on either side. And it's not intended to be, it's intended to wound the credibility of the other side. I actually am writing a piece about this where there's a lot of people on the left who were lamenting that climate change wasn't part of the campaign and that there were no questions about climate change in the debate. And my response is, thank God, because the more you inject climate policy into politics, the more damage you do to it, to the ability to come to a reasonable conclusion about it. Which, you're hearing a theme from me, right? That adding politics the more politics you put into something, the less likely you are to come up with a solution that achieves the goal that you want. And I think that that's certainly true with it. So it's frustrating for me, and I actually disengage from a lot of these sorts of discussions recently because it's very hard to cut through that, because I will always get questions from left-wing audiences about, why are you conservatives all anti-science? And then I lecture them that there's a fair number of things that the left is anti-science about, and they don't like that. And then the conservatives say, why is it that you're being taken in by the liberals and you're falling for their nonsense? And I have to lecture them about that they may be wrong about some things, but we have to deal with what we do know and a variety of other things, and they don't like that either. So it's a hard environment, The reason it's a hard environment, I think, is because it has become a political bludgeon as opposed to a policy discussion. And the more that we can move away from being a political bludgeon, the more that we can depoliticize it, the better I think we'll have a chance of coming up with policy solutions.
Any burning desire to chime in on any of that from either of you? All right, so let's take some.
Is that about right, Bob?
Let's take some questions from the audience, and I'm going to ask two things. One is keep your questions brief, and especially if you're making comments, then keep your editorial comments brief. And the second thing I'll ask is that if you are a progressive and you're not a student here at the university, then hang on and make sure that we give a chance for folks who are not in those particular overlapping groups to get their questions out first. So kind of prioritizing maybe folks who are students or folks who are conservatives. And I want to give them a fighting chance to get their questions in before, because it is Seattle, yes. So with that, yes, sir.
I was hoping to get your carbon cost calculations with hybrid cars, and if they are actually, if we're not overpaying for the amount of carbon we're saving in driving.
Did everybody hear the question?
So the question is, what's the cost per ton for a hybrid vehicle? Hybrids do cut carbon. So I haven't done the cost. What people will complain about, what you'll hear people complain about hybrids is, well, but there's all the batteries, right? The batteries don't last, and so you have to get rid of the batteries, and you have to go do new mining for new batteries and things like that. And so what I tell people is, what do you care about? Are you more concerned about the impact of climate change on the environment, or of mining and heavy metals and other things, and disposal and things like that? If you think that climate change is not a concern, then you probably think that hybrids are a net negative for the environment, because they do use more batteries and a lot more of those things like that, and disposal is more difficult. But if you're worried about climate change, hybrids are a net positive. Now, my feeling is, and I think that hybrids are perhaps the best example of the argument I made earlier about technology. If you want to spend your disposable income on a Z home, even though it's $100 a ton of carbon, I say go for it. It's your money, not mine. And if that's how you want to spend your disposable income, great, right? I mean, the people who buy the first iPhones, right, they spend $400. And then, a year later, it's $200, right? So you're spending extra money that you have in your pocket to buy that. So I'll just ask this. I ask this from time to time, not to take too long, but how many people own or know somebody who owns a hybrid like a Prius? It's Seattle, come on, like it's gotta be everybody here, right? How about an all-electric vehicle, like a Leaf, or golf carts don't count, it's not a golf cart, is it? No? Okay, all right. How about a hydrogen car? Anybody know a hydrogen car? So there's only two people I know who own a hydrogen car, and it's Brad Pitt and Jay Leno. And I'm always trying to find if I'm 1 degree of separation from either of those people, but not this audience. So the question is, which of those came out of the free market, and which of them were promoted by government? And the answer is that the hybrid came out of the free market. California's zero emissions law favored all electric vehicles, like electric or hydrogen. And the technology didn't emerge. But Toyota and Honda during the 90s recognized that there was a market for vehicles that used less gas, that saved money on gas and reduced carbon emissions and environmental impact. And so they built that vehicle. That hybrids did not meet the letter of the law of the California emissions standards, or of the zero emissions regulations. And in fact, California ended up having to change their regulations in 2003, 3 years after hybrids hit the market, because they said, there are no electric vehicles, but there are hybrids, and so they started hybrids counted. So technology coming from the free market actually trumped the regulations. They had to change the regulation to meet what actually existed. And now the irony is that the Prius is the symbol of environmental concern, right? And yet, it didn't come from the path that many people who are driving those vehicles believe is best for the environment. It came from the free market. And so I think it actually is this, what I tell conservatives is that the Prius is the symbol of conservative environmentalism, because it is creativity, it gives people options that they will use their disposable income that come out of the prosperity of the free market to do good things for the environment, because that's what they care about, and I think that's a great thing. So what I tell people is that whether hybrids make a difference for the environment depends on what you care about, and if you care about climate change, it's a good thing.
All right. Yes, sir.
While there's no doubt that human emissions are contributing to climate change, skeptics will sometimes say that things like the cycles of the sun are actually a lot bigger, and that the human effect is only augmenting that. Is there any truth to that, or is that complete? I'm trying to fit data to fit their more political states.
Did everybody hear the question? Cycles of the sun and impacts on temperature changes.
I am actually personally working on some research related to natural variability of climate on timescales of decades. And I personally think that may be big enough to modulate the rate at which the Earth is warming, so that we have flat periods like we're in the last 10 years versus periods when the temperature is rising rapidly. But I don't think that's nearly as big as the global warming signal. I think to find something as big as the global warming signal, you've got to go back to the scale of the ice ages, 20,000 years or so ago. There were big changes there, but actually not that much bigger than what we're talking about in expectations for the next 100 years or so if we do business as usual. So,
Yes, sir.
So it might be good to consider Newton's second law as we proceed. As in this particular situation, the action can meet a reaction. The action of shifting to a carbon-based tax can meet the reaction of a large number of invested industries in the existing petroleum system saying, no way.
Yeah. Well, you know, there's a big player in that business, ExxonMobil, you know, who has a chairman named Rex Tillerson who is in favor of a carbon tax. And has spoken publicly in favor of a carbon tax. And you think, now, this doesn't make any sense. ExxonMobil, Rex Tillerson, to be for a carbon tax. But I've gotten a real good explanation from the ExxonMobil folks as to why that is they say, listen, we're in petroleum and natural gas. We make money on both. In the case of petroleum, we think that it will always be the transportation fuel. In the case of natural gas, we can take out coal-fired electricity. So we can make money in both markets. And so that may be why Rex Tillerson can be for a carbon tax, which I celebrate. I think it's fabulous that they want to make money at both of these things. Because, you know, a little bit like on the theme that Todd is enunciating here, you know, conservatives really doubt the altruism of those who would declare that they are altruist, because we're saying you're altruistic only as long as your sugar daddy lasts. When your sugar daddy wears out, you're no longer altruistic. And so what we believe as conservatives is sustainability means being able to make a profit. If you can make a profit, it's sustainable. If you can't, it's not. And so I really celebrate the fact that Rex Tillerson is saying what he says, because it means they want to make money at this. They will accelerate. The carbon tax would only accelerate this swap that's happening right now with the move away from coal-fired electricity toward natural gas, because of the human ingenuity of directional drilling, fracking, those sorts of things that have created an expansion of the supply of natural gas, bringing down the price relative to coal, and making it far more attractive. So, yes, there are some, on the other hand, so who's going to fight back, right? So ExxonMobil may be with us, I mean, at least the public comments of Rex Tillerson are clearly in line with what I'm saying, what Todd just said. The people who you'd expect to be opposed would be the coal companies that realize what's going to happen to them, except for the largest coal company in the world, which is BHP Billiton in Australia. And their CEO, Mr. Kloppers, is, you guessed it, in favor of a carbon tax. And you might think, now this is weird. Why would the largest coal company in the world be for a carbon tax? Two reasons. One is they're also into uranium, and they figure that they're a diversified company. They can sell uranium if nuclear power becomes more attractive than coal. That's one reason. But the other is they've got 300 years of coal in the ground in Australia. Their main customer is the 1.3 billion people who live in China. And you know, if you're 1 in a million intelligence in China, there are a lot of you, because there are 1.3 billion people there. And so what they think is that their customer, China, is going to get tired of breathing that smelly air. And so their 300 years of inventory could turn into 10, 20 years worth of saleable product. And after that, it's worthless. Unless they can force coal up the technology curve and make it so that the other ways of dealing with coal become possible. So, for example, if you got geology that suits sequestration, it's a big if, and Professor Wallace might want to speak to that. If you got that, and if sequestration can work, you can use an IGCC machine which takes coal, breaks it into its component parts, takes out the mercury, takes out the sulfur before combustion. If you've got the geology that suits sequestration, then the only emission from that unit is water vapor. And you could burn that coal very cleanly if the sequestration is available. And so what Mr. Klopper says is, let's figure out a way to move up the technology curve here so that we can extend the life of this product we've got. Otherwise, we're kaput in coal when China innovates around us. But you can expect that not, I've asked the BHP folks, how are you received at the coal meetings? You know, are you like the skunk at the garden party? And so, yeah, sometimes it can be sort of dicey, the reaction they get among their fellow coal companies. Just depends on how forward-thinking that company is, whether they're as forward-thinking as BHP or whether they're sort of holding on to what they got and can't think beyond maybe a decade or two.
Now, Bob, I'm going to ask one quick follow-up question. So there are some folks on the left side of the political spectrum who say that the reason why Rex Tillerson is in favor of a carbon tax is because the political choice was between carbon tax and cap and trade, and he was just doing that to kill cap and trade. And that's an idea that has, you know, that it's come up in the news lately. So what's your view on that, sort of from, I don't know, the inside baseball, or your perspective on that?
Well, unfortunately, I don't know. I've asked to meet with Mr. Tillerson, but so far I've been declined. I just asked yesterday another time if I could meet with Mr. Tillerson, and so far there's been sort of a chuckle back, like, do you realize how important he is and how big of a company he's running, and do you realize how crazy it is that he would spend some time with you? I can't tell you anything from inside information, but if they're watching the tape, maybe they'll take that as a cue that, you know, if you want me to be able to answer that question, how about get me to see Mr. Tillerson?
So I think the answer is, why not call his bluff? Right? Why not? If he says he's for a carbon tax and people say, oh, you're just doing this for a political game, great. Call his bluff. See what happens. And then if he's lying, he's a knucklehead.
Yes, sir.
So I'm glad you brought up ExxonMobil and natural gas. I worked for TB and Pickens and learned a little bit about natural gas, and I'm curious. Professor Wallace brought up that GMO report, which was great. It said that natural gas is one problem, that it's made out of methane essentially, and methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon is, up to 27 times as much. And if there's just a little bit of leakage in the natural gas system from fracking to stovetop, it can be more than all the carbon emissions combined. And just 4%, and estimates are that 8% is leaking. So how does a carbon tax take into account the total problem that the energy economy can provide towards greenhouse emissions?
Question about how a carbon tax would deal with sort of fugitive emissions in terms of fugitive methane emissions, or maybe other issues like agricultural emissions from cows and things like this. Who wants to tackle that?
I can add at least a small insight on it. Although methane is much worse than carbon dioxide in terms of per molecule, the greenhouse effect that it has. The saving grace about methane is that its lifetime in the atmosphere is only on the order of 10 years. So you do have a worry if you've got a continual source of leakage from wells that's going to continue for decades, then you've got a problem. But if it's just an occasional burp once in a while, it's within a decade or so, it'll lose that extra potency, and it'll be just like carbon dioxide. That's what happens to it in the end.
My understanding, I would have three quick things. My understanding, one, is that the amount of methane in the atmosphere has basically flatlined. That CO2 is going up, but methane is basically flat. So even though we are using more natural gas, at least we're not seeing evidence of it that I know. The second thing is that I don't know. I have never heard the statistics you're talking about the percentages that leak, but I can tell you that percentage will go down over time because losing natural gas, wasting it, is not in the financial interests of the companies who do that, and so it'll come down over time the more they deal with it. And the third is my approach to a carbon price has been to keep it as simple as possible early on. If you focus on transportation fuels and electricity, where we already have taxes, right? We already have gas taxes, we already have energy taxes, and you do that, you achieve something like 95% of the greenhouse gas emissions. There's always going to be sulfur hexafluoride, right? So how the hell do you deal with sulfur hexafluoride, which is a byproduct of some industrial, right? I don't know. I mean, that's when you get really crazy. It's like the 80-20 rule, right? 80% of the problems come with 20% of the, and so my focus has been to deal with the 95%, and the 5% will still be there, and you may not be able to deal with it, but if you're dealing with 95%, you're doing pretty good.
I would just add, I definitely don't want to oversell the solution that we've got as a revenue-neutral tax swap, because it won't solve all the problems of the world, clearly. We hope to undersell and then over-deliver in terms of results. But the basic observation I might make is I think as you make, by pricing carbon, you actually will end up, if you do it the way that the bill that I proposed, it would be an upstream application of the tax. So it would be attached at the pipeline or at the mine. The result being that you make natural gas more dear. The result should be, therefore, that people are more careful in not having an escape. So it should actually cause everybody to be checking those stoves carefully, because it's more dear in price, because you've just been hit with a tax upstream that affects everything downstream. Of course, remember, in the tax swap, you got more money in your wallet because we reduced some form of income tax or some tax somewhere else. But it may help in some way deal with methane, because it makes natural gas more dear.
I'm curious to hear from Bob and Todd what you think about the dividend idea. So instead of reducing existing taxes, you can take the money and rebate it back on a per capita basis. I know Louise is here from Citizens Climate Lobby, and there are some other folks here who are from a group that's advocating this particular policy. And dividend ideas sort of have been also something that's been bounced around a lot. So what's your perspective on the dividend idea?
I think that a dividend is certainly within the possibility of how to return the money to folks. It's either through tax reduction or by dividend. There is one extra advantage of the dividend approach, I think, which is you create a constituency that supports the tax. Sort of like the Alaskan Oil Fund, the fact that people are getting that check makes it much more attractive. You're actually feeling the impact of it. And so there's some reason to really a political buy-in kind of argument for the dividend.
So a dividend is basically we put a tax on carbon, and we raise $1 billion, and then we count everybody up and we say, okay, there's 1 billion of you. Here, have $1 each. So that dollar is the dividend, right?
It's like the Alaska Permanent Fund. So the Alaska Permanent Fund takes in all this oil money, and then it goes into a fund, and they invest it, and then every year everybody in Alaska gets a check for $2,000 or something like this. So the idea is to do that with carbon tax revenue, where you dividend it out on a per capita basis to everybody in the U.S.
It seems to me that one of these consistent themes of Republican orthodoxy, if you will, since Reagan, has been to make taxation less progressive, or conversely, you're saying, I guess, make it more regressive, and trying to do the same thing.
That would be wrong, but okay.
Well, I don't think so. And then, having said that, I really don't think so. I mean, they're even trying to do it now by saying, well, we'll lower rates, but we'll just do rates and reductions. Same idea. And this is a regressive tax. So what you're doing is, particularly if say, want to lower the income tax and shift it to a consumption tax, we're shifting more taxation to those that least afford it. Unless you compensate some for it. But a dividend, as I understand it, goes to everybody. It doesn't just go to people on the low income side of things.
So the question is about the regressivity of carbon taxes and dividends. So actually, from the economics of it, works out that dividends are actually very progressive.
What if a dollar goes to, if the same amount goes to...
If the same amount goes to everybody, high-income folks use more carbon than lower-income folks. So on net, they're going to end up getting transfers from higher-income folks. But I am curious about how do you respond to issues of regressivity and other things like that.
Well, if you're very concerned about regressivity, then I think what you want to do is you want to either do the dividend, or you want to do in a per capita dividend. There are other ways to do dividend. It doesn't have to be per capita. You could do it in other. You could. That's the most commonly proposed is per capita, but it could be some other way. But if it's not that, then you might want to reduce the payroll tax, for example, which is an extremely regressive tax because it's the first dollar of income that you pay 12.4% taxes on.
Would you substitute that money then that goes into Medicare, Social Security, take it out of general fund?
No, in the bill that I proposed, it would have been, that's how we would pay for Social Security. The reduction in payroll tax, which cuts into Social Security, would be replaced by carbon tax revenue. But the reason, by the way, that Todd was maybe objecting, and I shouldn't speak for him, but I'll tell you my answer to the premise of your question, though, is remember, Ronald Reagan was the guy that was for the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is basically a negative income tax, which is quite progressive.
But that went with a huge reduction in the top marginal rate.
But it eliminated loopholes, and who do you think gets the loopholes? The poor people who don't have any lobbyists, or the rich people who do? That's right.
I'm going to get us back on track with a little story, which is that George Will, the Washington Post columnist, came to one of my classes once, and he doesn't believe humans are partly responsible for climate change. But I asked him if he would support replacing the payroll tax, the employment tax that Bob was talking about, with a carbon tax, and he said that he was all for it because he hates the payroll tax. And I hate the payroll tax as an economist with unemployment at 8%. And Al Gore hates the payroll tax. Al Gore says we should tax what we burn and not what we earn. So I asked George Will what he thought about the fact that he and Al Gore agreed on this particular issue. And George Will said, well, he said, an idea should not be held responsible for the people who believe in it. So that's my funny George Will story. This gentleman has had a hand up for a long time. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so it seems to be a feature unique to the American right wing, as opposed to the right wing in other countries, that it's considered a badge of membership in the right wing to be a climate change denialist. When in other countries, the conservatives just agree, okay, that's the science, let's get on with the policy and not dispute the science. So why is the right wing in the US different from the right wing elsewhere in this regard?
it's a great question. I think there are a number of reasons for the rejection of climate science. One of them, of course, is the biggest one I can think of is, and really you can track it when it happened, is the pain of the Great Recession. That when people are sort of busted down to the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, when they're thinking about just survival, this month's mortgage, this month's paycheck, when they used to be thinking about self-actualization, now they're busted down here to the bottom. That's what happened to me, actually. That's why I got tossed out of Congress, because I'm, Inglis, you're talking about things that are a decade away, man. And we're worried about this month's mortgage, this month's paycheck. Get out of here, right? And so that's part of it. But the other thing that I think is unique about America, perhaps, in this, in the American right wing rejecting this, is that the sort of the cap and trade, when you think about it, cap means there's some regulator who's come along in a government car to check on something, and trade was following the collapse of the banking system, the near collapse and the enormous complexity of all that. So there's a reaction against all that. But even more at base is, for a lot of Americans, I think it's seen as an attack on a suburban lifestyle. It's seen as, you're telling me that the whole way we built our life is wrong. That we're dependent on these cars, we live out from town, and now you're coming along with some pointy-head idea to tell me that the way that we did this is all wrong. And particularly when that gets into the realm of, you're telling me that my dad came home from the big war and built this economy on fossil fuels, and you're not going to tell me that he did this wrong. And so it's really more of a cultural attack than, but what we hope as conservatives of modern times to say is, who knew that smoking was a cause of smoke was a cause of cancer? When I was a kid, you had ashtrays in your house, and when people came to your house, you offered them an ashtray. They actually smoked in your house. They stunk up your house. Right sitting in your living room, they'd stink up your house. Well, now we know you wouldn't go to anybody else's house. I chew tobacco. You mind if I spit on your floor? You don't do that, right? And so we learn some things, and we move along. And so if we can do this as much as possible without recrimination and say, sure, Dad came home from the big war and built the country on coal, but who knew about these 23,600 deaths? Now that we know, Dad, can we maybe figure out IGCC machines? Well, actually, we can't figure them out. They exist. General Electric would happily sell them to us. But they can't sell them because it doesn't make any sense to buy an IGCC machine. In fact, if you live in a state with a Public Service Commission, they won't let you buy an IGCC machine because they're charged with delivering power at the lowest possible price without regard to the health insurance bill. So if you open up the aperture of that thing, you see, oh, I see we got a bigger problem. And we can learn from that. And Dad, you didn't do wrong by building it the way you built it. It's just, let's learn from what we did and now progress. And it should be that a generation says, well, great, you did something that we didn't do, and the next one will do something that you can't do.
With regard to science, one ought not be smug about who owns science, because there's plenty of anti-science attitude on each side. Let me just give you two examples of climate change. So the first time I actually worked with Dr. Wallace was when there was an article in the Seattle Times saying that coffee crops in Costa Rica had declined 20% in yield in the last several years, and that the whole premise, and it was front page above the fold, and they sent a team down to Costa Rica, and the whole thing was climate change. So I got on NASA's website. I said, holy crap. They must have had some unbelievable climate impacts that I don't know about, because looking worldwide, it just doesn't make any sense. So I got on NASA's webpage and I looked at the climate trends for the temperature, and there was less than 1 degree temperature change over the last 20 years. So why would less than 1 degree temperature change cause the collapse or the 20% reduction in the coffee crop? Well, it wouldn't. And I talked with plenty of coffee agronomists, and yet There were plenty of people who were claiming that climate change was the reason that the coffee crop had failed in Costa Rica. Simply untrue. Okay. You look at claims about sea level rise. Al Gore's movie, what is it, like 20 feet or something? He has a simulation for something. There's no projections. The IPCC says that's way beyond what the projected sea level rise is. The Puget Sound Partnership, Puget Sound put out a report talking about sea level rise, and they said that the sea level rise in Puget Sound would be 3 feet. And so I pulled up a report from the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington, and they said, no, it's about half that. And I said, why are you saying it's expected to be 3 feet? That's the high end of what the Climate Impacts Group says. Okay? So were they following the science? No, they weren't. They were using the highest end of the science to achieve another goal. That's why conservatives believe this is a hoax. Not because they have sat down and looked at the science and said, here's the problems, here's the errors. But they see manipulations of the science and they say, aha, I knew it. This is a smokescreen for something else. And that was what I was saying earlier, is that climate change is being used as a political bludgeon, which makes it very easy for people to dismiss whatever science, because if they think that the other side is playing political games with it, well, then I'm just going to play political games back. And we were talking about a petition that I was asked to sign on to where conservatives were opposing wind farms because wind farms killed 440,000 birds a year. It's like, you guys, you're not saying that we ought to stop development or other things because it kills birds, but somehow you do it because of windmills. So why are you picking out windmills? I'll tell you why they're picking out windmills. They don't like windmills because it's associated with the environmental community, and they want to stick it to the environmental community in the same way the environmental community is sticking it to them. It's a political game. And I pointed out that there are estimates that house cats kill 500 million birds a year. So if we're worried about 440,000 birds, good Lord, what must we do about house cats? But that's the games that get played. And so I think that when people on one side or the other say, you're anti-science, or why don't you believe in science, it is more a political game than it is a reality. And both sides have their weaknesses. And both sides, when they see an opportunity to fudge a little bit, they will fudge.
So Todd brought up sea level rise, and this is actually something where I worked on some sea level issues a number of years ago, and I'm certainly not a climate scientist, and Todd called me on some things that I did, and I'm grateful to him for doing that. Mike Wallace, since you're here, and I know sea level rise is one of the things that the IPCC has kind of struggled with and the scientific community has struggled with. Do you have an update on that for us?
Well, in their last report in 2007, the IPCC punted on the question of the contribution of melting ice to sea level rise. And they made an estimate based on the expansion of seawater, which that's a subject that's well known. They gave that, and they just said, we're not going to, in the time available, we just don't have time to look into the possibilities for melting ice. By the way, it's not the melting of the Arctic Ocean ice, because that's already sitting, that's like ice cubes in a glass of water. That melting doesn't do anything. It's the melting of the alpine glaciers, and particularly the continental ice sheets. And so I suspect in this round, which we'll be having a new report in about a year, I think there will be some statements about that. But I think the uncertainties will be huge, because we only have data on the rate of melting of the continental ice sheets for a couple of decades. And we don't know whether what we're looking at there is a natural fluctuation or a trend, something that's going to keep going the same way. But it could be anything from a small extra contribution to language that could be quite strong if there is a consensus that some of these trends that have shown up in the last decade, particularly in Greenland, are an indication of things that are going to be continuing. And I could see the possibility that could possibly double or even triple the projections for the the sea level rise by 2100.
So something to keep an eye on for the next IPCC report, which is coming out, I think, starting at the end of next year. We've got time for maybe one or two more questions. This gentleman over here at the end. Yes, sir.
I've got a couple of concerns initially with it. And one of them is...
Make it a quick concern and question, please.
Okay, we decrease the income tax, increase this other tax. American people understand the income tax. It's a little more intuitive. But we have a government that seems to hide taxes in every little thing all over the place. We don't really understand how much we actually pay in taxes. What do we pay? Income taxes is about $1.1 trillion. Gross revenue of the government is $2.5 trillion. So we've got an excessive amount of hidden taxes in every service and product we have that just keep on ratcheting up. And the other question that I guess the question I would have is how do we, when it comes to the balance between economics and environment, increase the cost of the environmental impact of the regulation, wouldn't that drive more business over to China where you have less environmental regulation, but thus increasing world environmental pollution? You may lower it in the US, but now you're just increasing it over there. The companies are paying less income tax on the money earned over there, and they're paying less.
So how do you deal with the leak? How do you deal with the leakage issues?
I think a good way to deal with that is a border adjustable tax. There's a lot of discussion about that yesterday at this conference, and there are proponents and there are detractors of that concept. But the idea is to basically do as the VAT in Europe is removed on export and imposed on import. So, for example, if you're exporting a BMW made in Spartanburg, South Carolina, I was telling Todd earlier, that means Bubba makes wheels. That's what BMW stands for. If we're exporting one of our cars from Spartanburg to, say, France, you pay VAT on the way into France, right? If you're exporting a Renault from France, well, I don't know why you'd want to do that. But anyway, if you were, and buying one of those, sorry if you own one, but if you were, you would remove, the VAT would be removed, right? A value-added tax in Europe. And so similar logic would lead to the idea that a border adjustable tax here could be WTO compliant. I will tell you there's a big debate about that, whether what I'm talking about right now is WTO compliant or not. I crave reference to VAT and notice that it's WTO compliant, so why not, when goods are imported to the United States, they would be, a carbon tax would be imposed upon them if that country of origin didn't have a similar carbon tax pricing mechanism in their economy. If they did, it comes in just as any other good would, without any punishment. And it's not trade punitive, what we're after here. We're just after, similar to a VAT, it's okay to remove it on export, impose it on import. So that's how you fix the leakage problem. In that first part of your question, though, I would say it is maybe a little bit harder to track that your power bill went up because of this carbon tax and your gasoline bill went up. But you've got an increase in your income in some way, or a dividend coming to you. But mostly, the most hidden tax is that health tax that we are all currently paying, and so it's the one that is most hidden from us. Who knows what the cost shift is at the hospital, right? For the 23,600 that die prematurely and the 3 million lost work days, those are real and quantifiable costs, but we don't really know what they are. They're really hidden from us.
I have a quick follow-up on that. You said that you'd be charged a tax based on the country of origin. Well, what if that business actually was a good steward of the economy? They did take the initiative to decrease their emissions, even though they're in a country that doesn't. Would there be a way to avoid that tax by proving that they've actually done what is right?
Yeah, good question.
As opposed to being charged simply because of where they are from.
Yeah, since I was hitting on Renault's earlier, I'll now give France this credit. Is that in the bill that I proposed in Congress, we actually would have given France, for example, the opportunity to petition for a lower rate because they are something like 90% nuclear in France. And so their carbon footprint of their typical goods is way less than ours. And so again, in order to make the argument that we're WTO compliant, we were prepared to give them the ability to petition and say, really, our tax should be lower or non-existent, because we really are rather low carbon intensity here in France.
With regard to the issue of hidden taxes versus visible taxes, that's why I like a carbon tax, because it is simple and transparent. The reason politicians like cap and trade is that it's very difficult to pin down. Right. Right. And so when you make something simple and transparent, you give people an opportunity to see, how can I avoid this? Right? We want to encourage people to avoid taxes. That's what we're encouraging them. And so things like the smart grid, which allow you to control your energy use better, are things that can give you tools, give the consumer more tools to avoid those taxes. There was a smart grid test that they did over on the peninsula, and they found that just giving people control over, rates and when they used electricity, that they reduced energy use by 10%, just by doing that. And so you do simple and transparent, people will find ways to avoid it.
The volunteer tax instead of the forced tax. By consumption, you can adjust how much tax you actually pay voluntarily based on your consumption, as opposed to income tax is forced.
Yeah, that's as Todd said, that's the whole point of it. We want you to substitute away from high carbon intensity, and that you do in the liberty of enlightened self-interest. You'll do it much faster than anybody telling you to do it, and so that's why we're big believers in this idea of substitution. Which is why, by the way, that the carbon tax that I proposed and that many others are proposing would be increasing over time, because if you have to have a stable revenue source for the government, that substitution is going to happen. So therefore, you want to have an increasing tax, but it is rather transparent. We know what it is.
I'll chime in, and then I think we'll have time for maybe just one more quick question. On the issue of taxes and how to deal with this issue of leakage to other countries, one thing that I find always a challenge is to think about, if you think about Mike Wallace's opening statement where he talked about not just the climate issues, but food and population growth. And I think it can be difficult to put yourself in the world of 2100 and look back and tell yourself a story that's got a happy ending, right? It's easy to tell stories that have pretty bad endings. And one of the things that I like the market story that Todd and Bob are sharing with us, and the idea that we're going to drive technology. And one thing that I think is great about carbon taxes, it's relatively easy to see how something like that might move nationally to internationally, where if the US said, we're going to have a carbon tax and we're going to have border tax adjustments, we're going to put a border tax on any country that doesn't join us, then that's an argument that could potentially push that carbon tax into the international community. And climate is rapidly moving from being a developed country problem to a developing country problem in terms of emissions. And so whether you buy that story or have your own story, I just encourage you to find a story that makes sense to you, so that you can continue to have hope and work on it. Yes, one last question.
Congressman Inglis, in the course of your conversations with largely Republican and perhaps more business-oriented voters and consumers and so forth, to what extent are you finding that they are getting what you tried to sell them on during your primary election, now that they've had a couple of years go by and they're closer to the actual situations that you were forecasting might happen? Do you see people responding more favorably in the conversations that you have and in the presentations that you make?
People that I see responding positively are typically young folks. Young conservatives really get this because they're taking Econ 101, and they're taking Chemistry 101, and they're taking Physics 101. So they track with us. And so what we're hoping is that they become very effective ambassadors to their parents and grandparents. In fact, all the students here, we've got a writing contest going right now. You get $4,000 if you win it. I'm going to offer you a suggestion here. You got to be under 25 to enter, but the winning entry may well be the one that's a letter to your grandfather, telling him, "Granddad, this is why this matters," because we think that's it's the young conservatives who are going to help their parents and grandparents see this and see the need and see the opportunity. Because it's an incredible opportunity if we play it right. This sort of transparent pricing, we believe, is the way to make it an incredible opportunity.
Is this a competition? Is there more information on your website about this?
Yeah, website, Energy and Enterprise Initiative. Go there and win $4,000. And lobby Alex over here, who's the primary, the first reader of all the submissions.
All right, please join me in thanking all of our panelists for a wonderful evening tonight. I'll mention, Bob Inglis in the Energy and Enterprise Initiative, and Alex Bosmosky is here with that. So energyenterprise.org. Todd is with the Washington Policy Center, which is a free market think tank here in town. If you're interested in learning more about these issues, and of course Mike Wallace is at University of Washington, so that's good too. If you're interested in learning more about these issues, there are folks in town who are working on that as well as the groups I just mentioned. So Louis Stonington is here with Citizens Climate Lobby. I am active with a group called Carbon Washington that's actively pushing a carbon tax here in Washington State, and I'm also a fellow at Sightline Institute here in town. And Bob and Alex actually have to take off in a couple of minutes to go up to Vancouver and Victoria in BC to learn more and talk to them about the carbon tax that they have up there. Sightline just had a blog post about the BC carbon tax, and it's really a terrific success story. It's 100% revenue neutral carbon tax in British Columbia. If you don't know about it, I encourage you to check out that blog post or otherwise learn more about it. Thanks to all of you for coming out here tonight. I hope this has been a valuable evening for you, and thank you so much for spending your time with us. One more time, a round of applause for the panelists.